And how about the sabotage of Nord Stream pipeline? How do you see it what are the impacts of this economically on Europe?
The war has hit Europe very hard because between sanctions and Russian countermeasures, the flow of gas and oil from Russia to Europe was basically ended, and that meant an energy supply crisis in Europe, and it will hit the European economy and drive the European economy into a contraction. Russia had basically turned off the flow of gas, but it could have turned it back on again in the context of negotiations. And there was calls for negotiations coming from German business, for example. Then, kaboom, the pipeline was blown up. My own guess is the United States blew up the pipeline because the United States always viewed the pipeline as Europe's dependence on Russia. And so by blowing it up, it would end the option of turning the energy flow back on. Of course, it would make the European crisis even deeper. But my guess is that the United States blew up the pipeline, partly because Biden really foreshadowed that in February, and people can find it online, in a press conference that he held with Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany. He was asked by a reporter what would happen to the pipeline if there's a Russian invasion. And he said, if Russia invades, the Nord Stream pipeline is over. And the reporter was quite surprised. What do you mean it's over? It's a Russia-German pipeline. And Biden says, believe me, we have our ways. You know, it's incredible. It's really remarkable to watch. And then after the pipeline was blown up, the Secretary of State of the United States called it a, quote, tremendous opportunity to finally wean Europe from Russian energy. Whoa, is that what you would say about sabotage of international infrastructure? That it's a tremendous opportunity? Wouldn't you say someone's committed a dastardly crime that has created an even deeper economic crisis and we're going to get to the bottom of it? Would you talk about it as a tremendous opportunity? Well, yeah, perhaps you would if you did it. So I'm of the view that the U.S. probably did it. I don't have definitive proof. I find it weird that when Sweden went to have a look at what happened, they ended up saying, okay, for national security reasons, we will not share the information of our investigation, even with Germany and Denmark. Oh, what did you find? A little American flag at the bottom of the sea? I don't know. But, you know, what do you mean you won't share the information with your neighbors within the European Union? It's all tantamount to Europe not wanting to know the real story, whether it was the UK backed by the US or the US backed by the UK or the US alone or whatever. We don't know. And no one's talking because the US government doesn't talk honestly about these things, obviously.
Professor Sachs, I know you visit a lot Europe. You know the governments, you know the people there. Why they are so much in hands of the US? They cannot talk. They cannot talk. Let's go to sanity. Let's stop insanity.
One thing is, you know, just the mere fact that you're 27 countries rather than one big one, that makes a difference. So the U.S. divides, you know, Europe, and that's a point. Second, some of the Eastern European countries, understandably perhaps, especially Poland, so anti-Russian that that's a big part of the U.S. position. A third part of the story is, of course, the U.S. is essentially the nuclear umbrella for Western Europe, and that's the NATO point, supposedly. And so they don't want to talk about it. But I've had leaders of Europe say to me privately, we can't. They treat us so badly. You know, the United States just, boom. And It's not understandable. Your question's a very good one. I expect Europe to understand its situation and to say we need a negotiated outcome on this. It's not anti-American. It's not anti-Ukraine. It's actually going to save the situation. They haven't said it yet. I'm not giving up.
Let's start with Seymour Hersh article in about the sabotage of Nord Stream pipeline. The timing in this article is so important because we know that in December 2021, Putin sent two letters to NATO headquarters and Biden administration. At the same time, the Biden team, Jake Sullivan, he was planning this sabotage, these explosions. How do you see this? When we continue in March, they started again to negotiate, but the plan was already they were determined to do this. So that's I think that's why the negotiations were failed. They didn't want the negotiations. How do you see the timing of these events?
No, I agree 100%. Look, first of all, just let's focus on what you're talking about in December. Right now there is a popular narrative that says that Russia carried out an unprovoked act of aggression against Ukraine when it initiated the special military operation in February of 2022. But just look at December. Who was doing what in December? Russia had just come off of 8 consecutive years of trying to get the Minsk peace agreement implemented. Russia was opposed every step of the way by Ukraine and its allies, Germany, France, the two nations that helped negotiate Minsk, and the United States. Joe Biden had promised in June of 2021 when he met with Putin in Geneva that Minsk would become a top priority. He lied. It wasn't a top priority. Shutting down Nord Stream was a top priority. That's been a top priority of the United States for many, many years now. Ever since Nord Stream 2 was conceived, we've been saying we're going to shut it down. And this, transcends administrations. The Trump administration prior to that were saying they're going to shut it down. The Obama administration was not happy about Russian gas going to Germany. So this isn't a Biden policy. This is an American policy. So when Russia is doing one last gasp effort to avoid a conflict by putting forward 2 draft treaties, not to compel the West to sign, but to encourage the West to read and discuss. That's all Russia was asking for. Read and discuss. The United States ignored it. And now, thanks to Seymour Hersh, we know one of the reasons why. Because the United States was looking for a confrontation. The United States needed a confrontation because a confrontation would give the United States, in their mindset, the justification for taking out Nord Stream. They needed Russian tanks to cross the border. And how do we know that? Because on February 7th of 2022, Joe Biden said just that. If Russian tanks cross the border, I will take out Nord Stream 2. Olaf Scholz was standing right next to him, didn't say a word. The look of shock on his face was unreal. It took a German journalist, a female, to actually have more courage than the German leader, a male, when she said, how could you do this? This is German. And Biden, again, gave a confession. We're going to do it. Now we move forward to March. The Russian tanks have crossed the border. But the plan is just a plan. It hasn't been implemented yet. We don't have the pieces in place. And those dirty Russians, how dare they try to stop the war soon? How dare they enter into negotiations? How dare they try to sign a peace deal that would terminate the war on 1 April? That had to be stopped. So the United States sends in Boris Johnson, who pulls the plug. And I think people need to reflect on that too. This war could have been over on April 1st. There would have been thousands of deaths, but not hundreds of thousands of deaths. All the people that were displaced would be home right now. All the jobs that were lost would be earning paychecks. All the infrastructure that has been destroyed would be up and not needing to be rebuilt because it's there. Life would be normal. Kids would be going to school. There would be heat in the homes, electricity in the houses. All that's gone because Joe Biden needed to blow up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And He finally got the opportunity to do it. They put the explosives in place sometime in July, and in September, he sent the buoy in, according to Seymour Hersh. Appropriate frequencies were generated, and at least 3 of the 4 bombs blew up, destroying 3 of the 4 pipelines. The timing,
But we have to consider, Scott, we have to consider the counterattack in Kharkiv. Because this comes right after that Putin announces that he's going to send more troops to Ukraine.
No, I mean, look, from the Biden perspective, and I've made this case all along. Joe Biden knew in September that Ukraine had lost the war. It was clear. It was clear to me. I've been saying that, but other people like to believe the lies. But Joe Biden lives in the real world, and he was briefed in September. I'm certain of it. What I already knew, that Ukraine had run out of everything, that they had expended their reserves. There were no reserves left to give them. There was no more manpower. There was no more equipment. There was nothing. And most importantly, there was no ammunition. Ukraine was running out of ammunition, and the West is desperately looking for additional stocks, and they can't find them. Joe Biden knew in September that it was over. Russia just mobilized 300,000 reservists. So he blew up the pipeline. Plus, you also have to remember, at the time of the pipeline explosion, the population of Germany was starting to get restless. There were demonstrations in the street demanding that Germany turn on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And so rather than let the Germans turn it on and further complicate efforts to shut it down, I think Joe Biden launched a preemptive attack just to take Nord Stream right off the table.
And your friend Ray McGovern and Jeffrey Sachs, they were briefing UN Security Council on the Nord Stream pipeline. And there are 2 sides to this story. We have United States on one side and Russia on the other side. United States was happy with Denmark and Sweden doing the investigations, but Russia is not happy with that. And we know that there were a bunch of countries that they wanted an impartial committee to investigate this. How do you see this?
Well, I mean, I've always operated under the premise that innocent people encourage investigations. Innocent people encourage thorough investigations. Innocent people aren't afraid of the facts. But who's shutting down the investigations? Who's putting the pressure on? The United States, which tells the United States isn't innocent. The United States did it. And the other thing it tells you is that Europe knows the United States did it. Because when these files of the investigations are sealed, what the public is told is that the information cannot be released because of the political sensitivity that would, if the release of which would bring harm to the national interests and security of the nation in question. Do you think for a second that if that this information showed that Russia did it, that they would be silent? If they had the proof of Russian guilt, they would be silent? No, they'd be screaming it at the top of their lungs. They would be publishing everything they had to demonstrate Russian guilt. They aren't, which tells you Russia is not guilty. The United States is guilty. And that's what I think of that.
The Russians keep giving evidence to the UN, and the UN, for some reason, doesn't take it quite seriously or puts it in some kind of bottleneck where it's not given appropriate attention. In any case, the Russians keep doing that. I think this will be discussed at the UN, the actual evidence that, as the Russians put it, the UK was involved. Now, the UK has these kinds of capabilities. Their special forces do. And it's, people tell me, inconceivable that it could be done without Sweden on purpose looking the other way, because that Baltic Sea is pretty much a NATO lake. So, whether it's the British or the Poles or both, or the U.S. involved in it, the only way you figure out who did it is cui bono. Cui bono, who profits? It's not really hard to understand. The only people that profit are people that were warning about the Nord Stream being a very, very dangerous thing because it makes Europe dependent on Russian gas. There is liquefied natural gas that is being supplied now at very high prices by the U.S., so there's some profiteering going on there. But most of all, look at it this way. When the Russians announced that, the explosive people, the saboteurs, didn't succeed in sabotaging all 4 pipelines. There are 2 pipelines for Nord Stream 1 and 2 for Nord Stream 2. So they didn't succeed. As a matter of fact, one of them still works. And Putin was asked, well, could that one be used? And he said, of course. But the Germans would have to agree to it. Now, German industry is falling apart. A lot of the big corporations are moving where? To the United States. German people are going to be very cold this winter. So is there any limit to how subservient the Germans will be when they see that their only hope of keeping warm this winter or preventing their industries from going completely kaput, in the German word, is to turn on that other pipeline. Now, it wouldn't be enough to substitute for what they had intended to get from the whole Nord Stream 2. It would be something. Now, are the Germans not able to stand up on their own 2 feet and say, look, it makes no sense to blame the Russians for sabotaging their own pipeline. Somebody else did it. Somebody who wishes us ill. Now, one of the pipes still works. Why can't we turn it on? Okay. Well, they haven't even been able to do that yet. And as far as the Russians are concerned, well, Putin is working out a deal with Turkey. There are ways to get this natural gas to Europe. You can go through Turkey. And Erdogan is clapping his hands. He goes, it's going to make Turkey still more wealthy. So what's going on there? Well, what I can say is this, that I have been amazed that the German people, and I know them well, I lived there for 5 years, bright and sensitive as they are, that they can't stand up to the U.S. 77 years after the end of the war. That's a long time. I've been saying for 10 years now that at some point the Germans are going to stand up and say, no, our interests come first, not your interests disguised as NATO's interests, not yours, but ours. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here. This is different. This is German industry imploding. This is German people putting on 5 overcoats, okay? I think this time the Germans may simply say, enough. Now, if they do, how are they going to operate in this EU? Well, the truth be told, the rest of the EU doesn't very much like the German policy. The Germans have put in all kinds of incentives so that their people can pay for the more expensive fuel to heat their homes and stuff. That's not really playing a fair game with the others. So it looks like for the first time in 77 years, in my view, things are going to just sort of dissolve, and the EU will be seen as some kind of creature of the United States, which it pretty much is, and the antagonism between the United States and Germany in the first instance, and the rest of them, France, Italy, and so forth, in the second instance, and the UK. I mean, between the United States, UK, and the rest of them is going to just get more intense. Now, what doesn't compute in my view is that the wise people that write for the Washington Post and work for our administration don't get it. Here's one example. David Ignatius, who writes in the Washington Post, he usually takes dictation from the CIA, whatever they say. He's made the big point today that the Russians are isolated. The Russians are losing out in the UN. Every little body is just marginalizing Russia. Well, give me a break. Russians aren't losing out. The Russians are not isolated. All you have to do is think about this alliance that we're talking about with Xi Jinping of China, and you've got almost most of the world. Tuck in India, which has not gone along with the sanctions and other repressive measures. Tuck in South Africa, Iran, Argentina wants to join the BRICS. Put them all together and you've got far more people than you have in what I call the lily white West. Look at them. Look at NATO. What's distinctive about NATO? All white. The closest you can come to people of color are the Turks, and they're sort of wiggly-washy about NATO themselves. But you have the lily white West against the rest of the world, for God's sake. Okay? Now, I like to joke, and I say the Russians have been blackened so much by U.S. propaganda that they're people of color too, and actually some of them ethnically are people of color. But you have the white against the rest of the world. And the white has this heritage of having been the colonialists that took advantage of the rest of the world. So, I expect to see, still in my lifetime, a devolvement, a kind of a bifurcation of these two worlds. And I describe it more as a bipolar. It's in the psychiatric sense as well. It's a bipolar division. Multipolar, okay. I mean, there's China, India, Russia, but bipolar in the sense that it's the West, NATO, white, against the rest of the world. Now, that's not healthy. That's really bad. And hopefully we can navigate through this mess by negotiations and by finally realizing that we can't be the sole indispensable, the sole exceptional country in the world. Now, when I lecture at colleges or universities, I ask them about these words, indispensable. I say to them, do you know what a synonym is? And usually a couple people are, oh yeah, that's a like word, a like word. Right, okay. What's an antonym? Well, probably one or two will say, yeah, that's an opposite word. That is the opposite word, okay. So I said, okay, good. Now let's take indispensable. What's the antonym for indispensable? And they stroke their chin and I guess it's dispensable. I said, that's right. You get it? By definition, all other countries are dispensable. And then they say, wow, I wonder how other countries feel about being dispensable. I'll tack on one other comment here, because we talked a little bit about what I call the apogee, the height of U.S.-Russian cooperation preventing a war in Syria in September 2013. Guess what? Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. It appeared on the 12th of September 2013. What did he say? Well, it was a nice little rundown of how the cooperation between our two countries, Russia and the United States, had prevented a wider war in Syria. And then there was this very curious last paragraph. It said, quoting, well, Putin wrote it, he said, you know, I really am grateful for the increasing trust between our two countries and between President Obama and me personally. I do object strenuously to the notion that any country is exceptional. President Obama talked in his most recent speech last week about how the U.S. is exceptional. I disagree. I think all countries are equal. I think that there are some that are farther along toward democracy. There are others that are struggling with various things. But when God looks down at countries of the world, God sees them as all equal. Period. End quote. Now, I was told at the time by some pretty good sources that Putin penned that last paragraph himself. Okay? And I got some confirmation of a kind about 3 years later when he was interviewed. It was a spontaneous response to this same kind of question. How do you feel about people being indispensable or exceptional? And he said the same thing in almost exactly the same words. So I think he did pen that last paragraph. And what he says, I have to say, is true. We Americans are not indispensable, surely, and we're not even exceptional. I believe that we're supposed to get along with all countries, that we shouldn't pretend to be the master or to dominate the rest of the world. And this, this has been our policy. I mentioned Wolfowitz doctrine, but it goes back to 1948. 1948, 3 years after the war, there was a new policy planning staff set up in the State Department, headed by George Kennan. George Kennan, the Soviet expert that I learned so much from, that was sort of like a mentor to me in those days. What did Kennan say? This was revealed later. In the first document that this unit put out, Kennan wrote, we have domain over 50% of the wealth in the world, but we only represent 6.3% of the population. Therefore, our policy has to be crafted in such a way as to maintain this disparity. We cannot be fooled by soft issues like civil rights or other things that are not strategic. It will come down eventually to hard power that we need to exert, period, end quote. Now, that was the mindset. And in those days, having survived the war without a lot of damage except for Pearl Harbor, where the rest of the world was on its back, it was possible for people like this, and Kennan was, I confess, an elitist, to think, well, Americans have most of the wealth, 50% of the world's wealth, and we have, we want to live the way we want to live, so we got to keep this disparity, as he calls it. Now, wow, is that what I believe should be the case? No. Is that what Putin believes should be? No. So, call me a Putin say I'm in Putin's pocket, if you will, but I think there should not be any concept of exceptional or indispensable countries. You know, I have a faith aspect to this. I'm a Catholic. And at their best, the United States Catholic bishops have issued some very strong declarations. You have to go back to the 80s, but they're there, okay? And their most important declaration has to do with what we've just been talking about. It's called a preferential option for the poor. Now, that sounds really pretty nice, doesn't it? Well, those bishops spell that out for us. You know what they said? If you want to be a Catholic, okay, here's the preferential option for the poor. No one is entitled to accumulate still more of what he or she doesn't need when other people are deprived of the bare necessities of life. Period. End quote.